She walked into a luxury dealership wearing nothing but jeans and confidence, only to be laughed out the door. What they didn't know, she was a billionaire heiress with a reason for staying silent, until the next morning, when a custom Rolls Royce pulled up and everything changed. If you feel drawn in, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have a story that will leave you speechless. I've worked at Boston Luxury Motors for just under 6 months, long enough to memorize engine specs and recite leather options by heart, but not long enough to forget where I came from. That morning, the sun poured through the dealership's glass walls, illuminating the polished curves of Bentleys and Ferraris like they were artwork in a museum. Everything sparkled, except the way we sometimes treated people. She walked in quietly, no heels clicking on marble, no designer handbag swinging from her arm. Just a simple woman in worn jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her face held that kind of peaceful strength you only notice if you're paying attention, but most people weren't. I watched as Blake, our sales manager, looked her over from across the showroom, his eyes sweeping her up and down like she didn't belong there. He smirked, adjusted his overpriced tie, and motioned toward the door. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice syrupy sweet but sharp underneath. "But these vehicles start at $300,000. You might be looking for a different location." I felt my stomach twist. The way she flushed, the way she just stood there for a moment, saying nothing, but feeling everything. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just nodded once, her eyes calm, and turned to leave. Customers nearby chuckled. One of the junior staff whispered something cruel. Blake didn't even look back. And yet, there was something in the way she walked out. Not defeated, just dignified. As if she carried something we couldn't see. I stood there frozen, watching the door close behind her, feeling like we had just made a mistake. A big one. Because while Blake saw someone who didn't look like money, I saw something else. I saw someone who deserved more than the world was giving her that morning. And I had no idea that she would be the reason everything was about to change. The morning sun was still rising when Margaret Collins, known simply as Maggie to those close to her, walked through the front door of her New England home. It wasn't a mansion lined with golden gates or glittering chandeliers. It was warm, wood-accented, tucked behind a line of tall oaks just outside of Boston, and intentionally understated. She didn't slam the door. She didn't collapse on the couch in dramatic fury. That wasn't her way. Instead, she stepped out of her sneakers and walked quietly to her husband's study, where Alexander Collins, her partner of 15 years, looked up from his desk. The moment he saw her face, he set his glasses down without a word. "It happened again," she said softly, her voice calm, but with that familiar tremble he'd learned to read. He didn't interrupt. He never did. She sat down across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and began to recount everything. How she had gone to Boston Luxury Motors to look for a birthday gift for her sister Caroline, who had just overcome a brutal battle with breast cancer. How the car, a rare midnight blue azure coupe, had reminded her of the lake they used to visit as kids. And how the manager had looked at her, dismissed her, because she didn't look like someone who could afford a car worth $250,000. "I didn't say anything," she added, eyes focused on the grain of the wooden desk. "But it stung." Alexander sat quietly for a long moment. "Would you like me to go down there?" he asked. "No," she said with a small smile. "I don't need vengeance. I've had worse. But I do wonder how many people walk into places like that and are told without words that they don't matter." He leaned back, arms folded. "And how many of them can't call for a car like that with a snap of their fingers?" She gave a soft laugh. "That's not the point." Of course she was right. She always was. Maggie Collins wasn't a woman who craved attention. She had spent the better part of 2 decades pouring her time, energy, and heart into the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities, an organization she had founded long before she met Alexander. Her degrees in special education and social development had become more than framed accomplishments on a wall. They had turned into real change: mobility aids, inclusive learning programs, speech therapy centers, adaptive sports fields. Her work had raised over $50 million for children who might never have had a chance otherwise. And while her foundation's reach had grown internationally, Maggie herself stayed grounded. She still showed up at every fundraiser, still held parents' hands in hospital waiting rooms, still delivered equipment to classrooms herself when schedules got tight. It was that very modesty that confused people. While the media often chased stories about glitz, red carpets, and celebrity donors, Maggie refused the spotlight. She drove a 10-year-old hybrid. She wore drugstore makeup. And that morning at the dealership, she'd worn the same white t-shirt and jeans she often wore when volunteering at a local therapy center. Because for Maggie, wealth wasn't about what you wore, it was about what you gave. But others didn't see it that way. Back at Boston Luxury Motors, Blake Thompson had told his staff the story of the delusional woman who wandered in asking to see an Azure coupe like she was picking out a used sedan. They all had a laugh about it over their catered lunch in the staff lounge. She seriously asked to see the interior, Blake snorted, sipping sparkling water from a glass tumbler. Can you believe that? Sneakers and all. Daniel, the youngest salesman, sat silently at the edge of the table. The memory of her flushed face burned into his mind. Something about the whole scene didn't sit right with him, and something about her eyes, steady, calm, self-contained, kept replaying in his head. She didn't look wealthy, no, but she hadn't looked lost either. She looked like someone who had already decided who she was and didn't need anyone else's permission to be it. That night, as Maggie and Alexander sat together over dinner, he leaned forward and asked the question she'd been avoiding. So, do we let it go? She hesitated. I'm not sure. Part of me wants to, but part of me keeps thinking about the look on that young man's face. The one who tried to help me before Blake cut him off. He seemed decent, embarrassed even. Alexander smiled. Decent men need examples more than vengeance. She looked up. What do you have in mind? And just like that, a plan was born. Not for revenge, but for perspective. A quiet lesson, crafted not to punish, but to reveal what happens when we judge a soul by its shoes instead of its substance. The next morning, something extraordinary would roll onto the dealership's marble driveway. A custom Rolls Royce Phantom, midnight blue with a chrome finish that shimmered like liquid glass in the sun. Inside sat a man whose name Blake wouldn't recognize right away, but whose presence would change everything. And as for Maggie, she wouldn't need to say a word. The truth soon would speak for itself. At exactly 10:17 a.m., the polished hush of Boston Luxury Motors was broken by a sound unlike any other. A deep, velvet-smooth engine purring through the glass facade like a whispered promise. Heads turned. A few early customers pressed against the showroom windows, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Even Blake Thompson, ever smug and composed, felt his chest rise as he caught sight of the car pulling up in front. Not just any car, a Rolls Royce Phantom. Midnight blue, extended wheelbase, custom finish that seemed to shift from sapphire to obsidian in the morning light. It didn't just arrive, it announced itself. Blake's heart quickened. Clients like this weren't just buyers. They were whales. Clients who bought fleets, not just Ferraris. They were loyalty contracts, referrals, prestige. And Blake Thompson had always prided himself on knowing how to charm a king. He was halfway to the entrance before the chauffeur even opened the rear passenger door. Out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind stitched in silence and paid for in six figures. Salt and pepper hair, clean cut, no tie, just confidence that didn't need to prove itself. His eyes scanned the glass showroom with quiet observation. Blake was there instantly. Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors, he said, extending a hand, every tooth in his salesman's smile perfectly aligned. The man took the handshake, but barely. Alexander Collins, he said. Blake blinked. The name sparked something faint in the back of his mind, but he couldn't place it. Still, the car spoke for itself. Well, Mr. Collins, it's truly an honor. What brings you in today? Perhaps I can show you our exclusive models? We just received. I'm here about a specific vehicle, Alexander said, cutting cleanly through the pitch. The Azure Coupe, midnight blue. You showed it yesterday to a well-dressed couple. Blake brightened. Ah, yes, of course. Very limited model. One of only 15 made this year. Incredible choice, sir. Alexander nodded slowly. I know. My wife expressed interest in it yesterday. She came in to inquire. Blake's brow furrowed for half a second, then recovered. Of course. I'm sorry. Could you remind me of her name? Margaret Collins, Alexander said plainly. She was wearing jeans, a white t-shirt. Blake's face froze. In that instant, the room's temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He swallowed. I believe there might have been a misunderstanding, he said, straightening his tie. We welcome all customers here, of course. But sometimes, attire can create confusion. Confusion, Alexander echoed, voice quiet but razor sharp. She was prepared to make a cash purchase. You suggested she visit your used car lot. Blake opened his mouth, then shut it again. Across the room, Daniel stopped what he was doing. His eyes widened. He took a careful step forward, close enough to hear, close enough to speak if needed. Alexander continued, and when she expressed continued interest, you not only dismissed her, but did so in front of other staff and customers. Publicly, loudly. The silence was now deafening. A few nearby customers shifted uncomfortably. Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had emerged from his office and stood by the side, watching the exchange with visible concern. I assure you, Mr. Collins, Blake said, his voice cracking slightly, we meant no offense. We simply... Daniel cleared his throat. Everyone turned. He looked young, nervous, but determined. Sir, Daniel said, addressing Alexander directly, your wife was polite. She asked about the Azure and was interested in buying it for her sister. Mr. Thompson interrupted and redirected her. Multiple times. Blake turned red. Alexander looked at Daniel for a long moment, then offered him a subtle nod of appreciation. Richard stepped in hastily. Mr. Collins, let me apologize sincerely on behalf of our entire team. This is not how we conduct ourselves. Alexander folded his hands in front of him. His voice softened, but didn't lose its power. My wife runs the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. She's raised over $50 million to support children who can't walk, speak, or feed themselves without help. She chooses to live modestly because it keeps her close to the people she serves. She didn't come in here looking for status. She came looking for a gift for her sister, who just survived cancer. Blake's shoulders sank. The weight of every assumption he'd made collapsed on top of him like a house of cards. She didn't demand an apology, Alexander added. She didn't ask me to come here. But I'm here because some lessons aren't taught in private. The room was silent. Alexander turned to Daniel. I'd like you to handle the Azure transaction, son, from start to finish. Daniel blinked. Me, sir? You saw her, Alexander said gently, not what she wore. Then with the same grace that carried him in, he looked at Blake one last time. There's a gala next month for our foundation. We'll need volunteers, people to help the kids. You'll be there. Blake opened his mouth to object, but stopped. There was no point. Yes, sir, he said quietly. And somehow it wasn't humiliating. It felt necessary. As Alexander moved toward the office to finalize the paperwork, Daniel stood straighter than he had all year. He looked at Blake, who gave him a slight nod, one that didn't come from pride, but from a place much deeper. A place that knew, for the first time in a long time, he had something to learn. Outside, the phantom waited in the sun. Inside, the room felt different now. Something had shifted, not just in reputation, but in perspective. And for everyone watching, it was clear. This wasn't just about a car. It was about what happens when dignity meets arrogance and wins quietly. Blake Thompson arrived at the Collins Foundation's Boston campus on a gray Saturday morning, wearing the required volunteer polo shirt and khakis that felt tighter than they should have. He was nervous, not the kind of nerves he'd felt closing a $1 million sale, but something deeper, the weight of having been seen for who he truly was and not liking what was reflected back. When Maggie greeted him at the reception desk, she wore her usual soft smile. No fanfare, no smugness, just the same calm presence he remembered from the showroom, only this time in a light blue sweater and a name badge that simply read, Maggie. Thank you for being here, she said. Blake hesitated, then nodded. I didn't come to make things right with words, he said quietly. I came to learn, if that's still welcome. Maggie held his gaze for a moment, then gestured toward the hall. Come on, we're setting up the indoor gym for adaptive basketball practice. The next 3 hours felt like a crash course in humility. Blake helped unstack folding chairs, pass out foam basketballs, and steady children into specialized wheelchairs. He learned the names of kids who couldn't speak but communicated more with their eyes than most adults ever did. One little boy, Thomas, age 8, spunky and blunt, tugged at Blake's sleeve as he struggled to shoot the ball with his one good arm. You're bad at this, Thomas announced. Blake laughed before he could stop himself. I know. You're tall but not useful. Blake laughed harder. Fair enough. Something in him, some old defense, unclenched. Later that afternoon, he helped serve lunch, refilled juice boxes, and tied a dozen shoelaces. By the time the event ended, his shirt was wrinkled, his back ached, and his heart felt changed. Not out of guilt, but out of understanding. As he sat on a bench near the exit, Thomas rolled over beside him. You coming next week? The boy asked casually, like it wasn't a question that might change a life. Blake looked down at the scuffed floor, then up at Maggie across the room, speaking gently to a young girl with a walker. Yes, he said. Yeah, I think I will. Over the next few weeks, Blake showed up, not out of obligation, but with a sense of something new forming in him. He listened more, watched more, not just the kids, but the staff, the parents, the other volunteers. He noticed how Maggie never sat still, but never rushed, how she remembered every child's name, every diagnosis, every sibling. She never talked about her foundation's millions, her Rolls Royce, or the injustice she'd suffered. She led not by words, but by presence. And for the first time in his life, Blake began to redefine success. It wasn't about sales metrics or VIP clients. It was how people feel after being around you. It was whether you saw people or skimmed past them based on what they wore or drove. One evening after a practice, Blake walked Maggie to her car, a modest SUV with a booster seat and a box of art supplies in the back. I owe you an apology, he said. Not for what I said, though that too, but for who I was when I said it. Maggie paused at the driver's door. You're not that man anymore, she said. Blake looked down, his voice quieter. I didn't think people like you existed. Not just the giving, but the forgiving too. She smiled gently. It's not always easy, she said. But if we don't believe people can change, what's the point of anything we do here? That night, as Blake drove home, he passed by the dealership where the story had started. The lights were off. The showroom was empty. And for the first time, he felt no pride when he looked at it. Only perspective. Because that building had given him a title. But this place, the foundation, Maggie, the children, had given him a new self. And that was worth more than any commission he'd ever made. The ballroom at the Boston Grand was bathed in soft golden light, its chandeliers twinkling like a sky full of stars. Elegant centerpieces of white roses and navy satin lined each table. But the most radiant thing in the room wasn't the decor, it was the feeling. Tonight wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about donors or numbers on a check. It was about hope and the children whose lives had been changed by the Collins Foundation. Blake stood near the entrance, wearing a black volunteer vest instead of a tailored suit. He hadn't wanted to be mistaken for a guest. Not tonight. Not yet. He greeted attendees, guided guests in wheelchairs to their tables, and helped a nervous teenager rehearse the short speech she was giving about her new therapy dog. He had never felt more useful in his life. Across the room, Maggie moved through the crowd in a navy blue dress, simple, elegant, unmistakably her. She paused to speak with parents, volunteers, and foundation staff, offering each of them her full attention. When their eyes finally met across the ballroom, Blake nodded. She nodded back. Later that evening, as the final round of applause echoed through the hall, Blake approached her by the side of the stage. Mrs. Collins, he began softly, I know I've said thank you, and I've said I'm sorry, but tonight I needed to say it without an audience. Just you. Maggie turned to face him fully. I was wrong, Blake said, voice steady. Not just in how I treated you, but in how I saw the world. I thought power came from suits and sales numbers and expensive watches. But it's not. It's here, in what you've built, in how you carry yourself, in how you see people. She looked at him, eyes kind but unwavering. You've shown up, she said, again and again. That means more than any apology ever could. He smiled. Thomas says I'm still terrible at basketball. She laughed gently. He says that to everyone. There was a pause, not awkward, just full. I don't expect a second chance, Blake added, but I'd be honored to keep volunteering, to keep learning. You don't have to earn it anymore, Maggie said. You've already started. Just then, Alexander joined them, placing a hand on Blake's shoulder. I hear you've been helping Daniel with new customer training, he said. That's a good thing. We've stopped qualifying people by how they look, Blake replied. We're learning to listen first. Alexander nodded. Which reminds me, about that corporate fleet I mentioned a few weeks back. We're still in the market. Blake blinked. You'd trust me with that? I'd trust the man standing in front of me, Alexander said, not the one I met at the showroom. Blake swallowed hard. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a restoration. As the evening wore on, Blake watched Maggie and Alexander move gracefully through the crowd, shaking hands, hugging kids, thanking guests. They didn't flaunt power, they wielded kindness, with intention, with love. And Blake, who had once measured success by deals closed and dollars earned, now understood a deeper truth. The true measure of a person is how they treat those who have nothing to offer them. And in that truth, he had found not just redemption, but purpose. And for the first time in his life, he was proud of the man he was becoming. Sometimes the most powerful justice isn't loud. It's quiet, filled with grace, dignity, and the courage to walk away when wrongly judged. A simple woman kicked out of car dealership is more than just one of those emotional stories or touching stories we passively watch. It's a reminder of who we are when no one important is looking. This tale belongs among the most incredible stories in narrated stories that challenge our assumptions. It asks, how many times have we misjudged someone based on their appearance? How many times has kindness gone unrecognized because it wasn't dressed in wealth? In this heartwarming story, justice wasn't delivered through revenge. It came through humility, transformation, and service. It is one of those rare justice stories where the lesson outlives the moment and where quiet strength speaks louder than confrontation. Whether it's a black man fighting against stereotype, a woman underestimated for her simplicity, or any of us choosing kindness in a world that rewards flash over substance. Unraveled Fates reminds us, appearances lie. Character doesn't. This is why we tell stories like this, not just to entertain, but to reflect, to grow, and to create waves of justice in our own lives. If this story moved you, please share it. Let others feel its truth. We need more narrated stories that make us think, feel, and act. Because every time we choose to see someone fully, we change the ending for the better.